sometime right after I think right before Christmas or so. And I ran across at the bottom in the books of the year, a review of the honorable mention book. And at the bottom, it surprised me. It said, University of Missouri History Prof. John Wigger. It seemed vaguely familiar to me, but I wasn't sure why. I reached out to John and said, hey, Christianity Today, checked your bio. It's got Fuller Seminary. Here's kind of what we're about. And as a Christian Studies Center, we care about the preservation of evangelical scholarship and also celebrating particularly our tenured faculty who are maintaining a vibrant faith on campus. And so we had coffee together and enjoyed our conversation immensely. And so as a result of that, invited John to sort of come and talk with us both about who he is and his work, and then particularly as it relates to what was last year's Christianity Today Book of the Year in the history section, and that's the PTL, The Rise and Fall of Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker's Evangelical Empire. So give a warm TEI welcome to John Wigger. All right, John, so when we visited, you talked to me about how you were out on the West Coast. You had a life ahead of you in terms of engineering, and then you got interrupted by taking some classes at Fuller Seminary and began to sense a new kind of direction for your life. Would you share that with the group a little bit?
Yeah, wow, that's taking it way back. So thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Rod for inviting me. Yes, I was an engineering undergrad, petroleum engineering, and after graduating at West Virginia University, I took a job on the West Coast because for someone that grew up in Appalachia, working in a beach town, I lived in Ventura, California, was like dying and going to heaven. And I worked for Conoco, drilling oil wells in California. And after a few years of that, I kind of sat back and said, I am making way too much money and having way too much fun. I've just got to do something else. So, well, you guys are a tough audience. So I started taking classes, extension classes from Fuller because they offered them in town and in Santa Barbara. And I just took to it. I liked it. And what I discovered is I'm no theologian. My mind just doesn't work that way. But I really liked the history. And so eventually I decided to quit my job, go back to grad school, went to Notre Dame in the history department, worked with some great scholars, George Marsden, Nathan Hatch.
I pulled this one off the shelf, was sort of my first introduction in seminary.
That's a long.
Do you recall that resource, by the way? And so George Marsden and Nathan Hatch, and of course Mark Knoll, all were there, and you had the privilege of studying under and with them.
Yeah, Mark Knoll wasn't there at the time. He was still at Wheaton, but he did end up at Notre Dame eventually. Yeah. So it was a great place to be, and after I finished there, I ended up in Missouri.
So you came to Missouri in 1995. 1996.
I think so, yeah.
And have worked in the history department there and served in a variety of capacities, and et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So this is what I'd like to talk to you about, though I know you're somewhat hesitant, I think, about it, at least you. That's what I got when we met. And that is that you have maintained an evangelical, I mean that in the best sense of the word, evangelical, high view of Scripture, passion for life with Christ, all the best benefits in a broadly evangelical way. You've maintained that within the history department, and you've not always done the work that your peers have valued and appreciated, but you followed your conscience in it, and you've also been a safe place for some evangelical scholars like Jonathan as well. And I respect it and appreciate it, and I just wonder what you'd be willing to say about it.
Well, thank you. I think the only reluctance I had is I'm not sure how well I've done all of that for 23 years. It's a state university. It's a decidedly humanities at a state university is a very liberal place. So I'm sure I'm the only evangelical on faculty in the history department. But I don't think I've suffered in any significant way because of that. Yeah.
I hear that. But you have been a place by which you've encouraged some other evangelicals to maintain their faith and then to continue to think as a Christian in terms of their history vocation. Would that be fair to say?
In particular, I've had wonderful grad students who have gone on to establish great careers, almost all of them evangelicals or people of faith. It's been a wonderful privilege. That's the best part of what I've done in the city. And there aren't very many places where you can do a PhD in history and do it as an evangelical. So yeah, that's been wonderful.
You've been a part of helping to preserve that. And I think it's important that we as a faith community are more mindful of what you said about the environment and ways in which you're working hard to preserve your faith and encourage others in it. And so that's why I bring it up. And then also the work that you've done, not only this, but also Francis Asbury, and then also work related to Methodism in particular, has been your style. And that's not necessarily what your peers would have encouraged you to have written on per se.
Well, probably not, but I think most people in their jobs feel that way, that their work is maybe undervalued. So I don't think that I don't think I can claim any great disadvantage in that way.
You've had an interest in Methodism.
Yes.
No, you're not Methodist, right?
You know, what I found when I started all this was the thing that interested me most were groups that grew and got big in a hurry because they did something new in their cultural setting. They found some new way to connect with people. And in earlier America, late 18th, early 19th century, that was the Methodists. They grew dramatically. It's kind of hard for most people to believe now because Methodists aren't growing. Not in that same way, like most mainline churches, that's just not the case. But at that time, they were a vibrant part of what was happening in America, in Christianity in America. Pentecostals are the same way in the 20th century, so I kind of transitioned from early Methodism to Pentecostalism, this last project.
Gotcha. And just a quick word about your current work, because you're on sabbatical.
I am.
And you have an interest outside of faith and evangelical.
Yeah, I'm doing something different. It just seemed like time to do something different. I grew up flying with my dad. Some of my earliest memories are in airplanes. And so I'm writing about pilots in the early 20th century. Wing walkers, parachute jumpers, it's a lot of fun.
Very cool. All right, and we will be opening it up for comments and questions and discussion along the way, but let me run through a few things related now to our topic at hand. Wow, okay. First of all, a bit of chiding about this phrase right here, towards the end of the book. Branson, Missouri is Vegas without the gambling, booze, and prostitutes. That's fine, no worries there. Where stars live on even after they are dead. Did you say that? Is that what you said? And then you go on to say, a vacation for seniors in a place where has been and never were entertainers. Go to make one last stand. Is that the book? No comment needed. I was just Branson, huh? All right. Hey, what surprised you most during this writing process?
That is a great question, and it's one I often ask people about their books. I think a couple of things. I think the intensity with which people were devoted to PTL, because one of the things that happens is most people's entry point, if they remember this at all, if they're old enough to remember it at all, is the scandal. So most people, that's when it hit their radar, was the scandal in '87 and '88. And Jim Bakker's trial after that. But there's a history before that, a long history before that. And I think when I talk to people, I more or less heard the same thing from everyone who was involved, which was, it was the best thing I ever did, and it was the worst thing I ever did. And I think both parts of that are important. And the best thing that I ever did, part of it, just took me a while to appreciate why that was.
I want to, before we launch into let you do some pictures and then we'll tell the story and that kind of thing. I want to ask you about the mindset of a historian. So what are you doing with what you were saying? Now, I have thoughts about what you're doing, and so because I'm going to ask you later on to talk about learnings and conclusions and those kinds of things, but there's a sense in which, in order to do justice to your vocation, I think that you're also trying to tell an accurate story of what happened so that individuals down the road, future generations, pastors, theologians, scholars, can have an accurate representation in order to draw those kinds of conclusions from the case studies. Tell me if I'm right about that or not.
These kinds of projects always start with questions, usually one big question that you have. And that's why you continually have new books on more or less the same topic, because people come to them with different questions. So the big question I came to with this study, which I've already alluded to, is how did it get so big? Why did it attract so many people? What did they do that launched them on this trajectory that made them such a big deal by the mid-1980s? And then the follow-up to that is, how did it all fall apart? What undermined all of that enthusiasm and growth and success? What pulled it all down? Mm-hmm. And those were, I think that was the original sort of set of questions, two things that I was after.
And the way you stated that all the way at the end of the book, not to give all of it away, but the way then you came to that conclusion about it was related to the fact that, if I may say, you said, regardless of PTL's fall, the connection between religious innovation and popular culture remains a powerful force in American life. PTL will not be the last of its kind. So in our evangelical attempts to be culturally connected, you're saying that there's an inherent risk and reality about that very process.
Yes, that's good, Rod. You're good at that. You're a good interviewer.
Thank you. And it's implicit throughout the book, but it's stated right at the end of the book.
Right. So in some sense, people could say, why do we need this? And I've heard that. I mean, Jim and Tammy, they're done. You'll never have this kind of television thing again, televangelists in the same way. And I think the answer is you may not have that exact same thing, but the sort of underlying forces that created it are not going away. I mean, they change settings, they change the particulars of how it all works out, but the kind of underlying forces are still all there.
Yeah. All right, I want to change the vibe just a bit, and I want you to take the lead, and you run as long as you want to, and then I'll support in terms of questions and those kinds of things. Whether it's telling the story, talking about, where they came from, how they start, all those kinds of things. And I'll let you run for a while. When you feel like you're done, and I certainly can take us to other places.
Okay. And please, if you have questions, I would like this to be as interactive as possible.
Okay.
I think that would be the most fun, and I think it would probably be the most helpful. So Rod asked me to have 3 to 5 minutes of intro material, and the best way to do that seemed to be still images rather than any sort of video that I could think of. So here are some still images, and I'll just start out and try and guide us a little bit through this. Am I loud enough? Yeah. Okay, good. So this is Jim and Tammy at the height of their careers. in the mid-'80s, looking very confident and very much in control, which they were. What were they involved in? By this time, they had Heritage USA, which is this, it's often described as a theme park. I think that's a little simplistic. It was a ministry center. It was the place that they broadcast their television show from. It was where they did everything. They did have lodging. People could come and stay. It was this sort of wonderfully big and safe Christian Disneyland, which is exactly what Bakker wanted it to be. He modeled it after Disneyland. He visited Disneyland to get ideas. It was supposed to be exactly that. It was over 2,000 acres. At its height, they had about 2,500 employees. They were spending about $2 million a week. They had their own independent satellite network that reached 13 to 14 million people a day. And all of this in 15 years. And then it ends in this. This is this iconic picture of Bakker being led from his lawyer's office, Harold Bender, by federal marshals during his federal trial for wire and mail fraud. So where does it start? I guess I don't have any childhood pictures in this presentation, but Jim grew up in Muskegon, Michigan. His dad worked at a factory for 46 years or so. He grew up in the Assemblies of God Church, went to North Central Bible College, and here's an early picture of him posing, I think, as a preacher. Tammy grew up in International Falls, Minnesota, one of, I think, 8 children. You know, surprisingly, you write these books and then you forget. Read it. But she did grow up in a house without indoor plumbing in International Falls, Minnesota. She also ended up at North Central Bible College a year after Jim. Her first year there, they found each other. They went on 3 dates in a week, and at the end of the 3rd date, Jim asked her to marry him, and she said yes. So she said later that she was, whatever, 4'9", 10, 83 pounds. Yeah. They look cute together, don't they? They dropped out of North Central when they got married. They more or less had to do that because the school didn't allow students to marry during the term. And then they launched a career in a kind of serendipitous way as healing evangelists in the Southeast, in mostly small Assemblies of God churches. And here's a picture of them on the right in one of these church gatherings. Along the way, to sort of, as a feature of these crusades they would hold, they came up with puppets for a children's portion of their ministry. And they made the puppets themselves. The original heads were from, I think, bubble bath bottles. And they created a whole puppet family. And they would have a little portable stage, and Jim would be the straight man out front, and Tammy would work the puppets behind the stage and do their voices. And I got to tell you, from later, she did this for quite a while, and from later videos, there's none from this period, but from later videos, Tammy was actually brilliant with those puppets. She was brilliant. The voices she gave them, the emotion she was able to convey, she was just wonderful, and it fit what Tammy wanted to do because it allowed her more or less to hide behind the stage, right? I think later her makeup was just a mask, a way to hide from people, and this was sort of the same thing. They expanded out here. At least the 2 on the left are her Tammy's favorite puppets, Susie Moppet and Allie Alligator. And then what happened is Pat Robertson had gone to Portsmouth, Virginia, to start a Christian television station on one of these old UHF channels. If you're old enough, you remember UHF. Their antenna was on a telephone pole. It, as they used to say, it barely reached across the city, but it was his attempt to start a Christian television station. We can talk more about Pat Robertson if you want. But he became aware that Jim and Tammy did this puppet show, and so he had one of his producers, Bill Garthwaite, go out and see Jim and Tammy do this, and he recruited them to do the puppet show on his television station, actually an entire kids show
on his television station, and Jim and Tammy became stars. They became probably the most popular act that Pat Robertson had on his small Christian television station. The success of that, as Bakker later told it, and other people more or less corroborated this, was that the success of the children's show allowed him to pitch an idea to Robertson that he had long wanted to do, which was to create a Johnny Carson style talk show. The way he told it is when he and Tammy would travel around from church to church, they would unwind at night they pulled a trailer behind their car for most of their time as traveling evangelists. They would unwind by watching The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, which in the 60s was like the height of cultural cool. It was like Jon Stewart and The Daily Show, 6 or 8 years ago. And Bakker would sit back and say, why can't we do that? Why isn't there a version of that on television? And that's innovative to think that, because at the time, Christian television was Billy Graham crusades. It looked like church on television. Basically, when people did Christian television, they more or less just broadcast church services. And Jim Bakker sat back and looked at that and said, it's just boring, right? It's not what people want to watch. And so he talked Robertson into allowing him to create this television show. This becomes the 700 Club. Robertson, of course, later disputed that it was really Jim Bakker's idea. He more or less said that it was kind of his idea. He eventually gets crossways with Robertson at CBN and moves to California, where he starts another Christian television station with Paul Crouch. Paul Crouch is second from the right. Bakker is right next to him. This is them wheeling in some of their new TV equipment as they start this station. It was all really makeshift, secondhand equipment repurposed to use for another little UHF station. It was beginning to be successful when Bakker and Crouch sort of got crossways with each other. And then in 1972, Jim and Tammy end up in Charlotte, where they begin a show, which becomes the PTL Club, that they broadcast on a local UHF station. They build their own studio in a former furniture store. I mean, they had nothing when they started out. They had no money. They had 6 employees in quotation marks because most of them they didn't actually pay, or they paid irregularly. It was really small time, and this is 72. And I think one of the reasons I tell this story is there's nothing to predict in 1972 that they're going to be what I showed you at the beginning by 1987, 15 years later. It's only 15 years. I mean, think back 15 years in your life. It's really not all that long, and they go from basically nothing to this empire, this enormous empire. Here's an early version of the set. Of course, it was a call-in show. They would do these telethons. This wasn't the way the show looked all the time. A lot of people only remember this, the telethons. Of course, they were fundraisers. They didn't run commercials during the show, so they had telethons. And to people who smirk at that, colleagues who smirk at that, I say, how much do you like NPR fundraising week, right? How much do you like that? It's pretty much the same thing. Your local public radio station. Basically turn around and think, God, geez, here's a week I can't listen to. Sorry. They become very big, very slick. This is later in the mid-'80s, the television studio. It's kind of hard. It's very busy, but you can see it's big time television by the mid-'80s. Their equipment was every bit as good as the network shows. If you juxtapose this to mid-'80s talk shows that were big on networks, Phil Donahue and Oprah's a little bit later than this, their sets don't actually look this good at the same time. Here's one of their later sets. They kind of transitioned, and this is a way in which they followed the culture, so to speak. Early on in the 60s and 70s, they were going for a Johnny Carson style where, Bakker would sit behind a desk and his guests would sit on couches next to him. And then by the 80s, they transitioned into what looks like more of a homey setting, where Jim and Tammy sit on a couch and their guests sit on couches next to them. The musicians are just sitting on tables and couches in the background, and when it's their turn to perform, they just sort of get up and casually walk over to their instruments like they just happen to be there, ready to play a song, right? And it looks very 80s comfy, cool. So they continued to evolve this concept of what they were doing on television. Interviewed a lot of people. Their shows were jam-packed with celebrities from across the spectrum. There they are with Billy Graham, Mr. T. Tammy did this series of interviews with Hollywood celebrities who were Christians, who were evangelicals. Colonel Sanders, this is actually from earlier. Eventually, their clout makes them attracted to politicians. Bakker visited the Carter White House, flew in Air Force One with Jimmy Carter, did this interview with Ronald Reagan when he was running for president in 1980. Yeah, Heritage USA again. Heritage USA, the reason Bakker built this whole complex was it was an extension of camp meetings. He had gone to camp meetings as a kid. And he remembered it fondly, but he thought it needed updating. He thought, look, people don't want to go to the old-timey campgrounds anymore and sleep in these makeshift cabins and tents, and go to the big tent tabernacles. Pentecostals, by this time, these constituency assemblies of God are essentially middle-class people. And when they went on vacation, they wanted to feel like they were actually going on vacation, right? And so this is his inspiration for creating the whole Heritage USA complex. My slideshow's kind of taking me out of sequence here, but let's just go with it for now. They built a 500-room hotel, the Heritage Grand. Here's the lobby of the Heritage Grand. For mid-1980s, it's really pretty cool. They had a kind of shopping mall connected to it, Main Street USA, modeled after a similar thing at Disneyland. Lots of shops, and it's all indoors. They had I think at that point, what he used to say was the world's biggest water park. And it was enormous. They had a train like the one at the St. Louis Zoo. In fact, it was modeled after the one at the St. Louis Zoo. Ran around the park. They started another 500-room hotel, the Heritage Towers, Grand Towers. This is what it looked like when I was there, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago. Since then, they've torn down the Wendy's Castle restaurant, but the Towers is still there. It was never completed. It's kind of decaying in the Carolina sun. This is an aerial view of the park. You can see the Heritage Grand Hotel at the top and the towers next to it. They had an outdoor amphitheater there in the middle where they performed all kinds of things. Down at the bottom is the barn, which was their original meeting place and television studio. The buildings around it were more modern television studios and counseling center. There are other buildings throughout this complex. I mean, it really was something. They weren't finished when it all fell apart. They were tied up in the prosperity gospel in the mid-'80s, very much so. They had jets, a Saberliner jet. They had Rolls Royces. Yeah, they had plans to build even bigger things. This was his Crystal Palace Center that was on the drawing boards at the time, which was something like 1 million square feet, would have been the biggest church on earth. Never actually got off the ground, so to speak. And it all comes down, so I'm kind of ahead of myself before I get to Jessica Hahn. Let me just kind of back up, Rod.
Let's do it.
Maybe the slideshow hasn't served me the best in this sense. So how does it grow? Why does it get big? I think they really have three basic innovations. The first is the Christian talk show. So they create this new thing to draw people in, and it was immensely popular. People watched it and they were fascinated by it. It was a form of Christian television that just seemed culturally relevant, that seemed cool. They had on an amazing array of guests, famous people, not so famous. It was innovative in its setting. So the Christian talk show. The second was when they were at the small UHF station in Charlotte. That station was bought by Ted Turner. And at about the same time, Ted Turner came up with the idea following what, the movie channel.
HBO.
HBO, yeah. So they're, no, not HBO. Anyways, so so Ted Turner is the first that puts a television station up on satellite. And the PTL guys are seeing this because their station is owned by Ted Turner. And they basically say, why can't we do that? And they do something even more innovative than Turner because Ted Turner didn't own the whole uplink system from studio to satellite. He had an intermediary, a carrier that actually beamed the stuff up to satellite. But some really creative guys in Bakker's office, Roger Flessing and some others, they go to the FCC in Washington and they say, we would like to become our own satellite carrier and own our own station. And there were, now of course there are, you know how many satellite channels there were, but at this time there were only a few options and there were only so many transponders available on the satellites. And they leased one of these transponders. So they had their own dedicated 24-hour-a-day satellite network. It's a year before ESPN. It's before almost anyone does this. And it turns out they spend what seems like a lot of money, but it turns out to be a bargain. And so now they have the ability to reach not just this little audience that they're reaching in Charlotte and a larger network of stations actually that they were reaching in the old-fashioned ways. But they now can beam their shows directly from satellite. And it just becomes, it opens up all kinds of possibilities. It opens up a bigger audience for their shows, but it also allows them to sell airtime to other ministries. And they sell airtime to everybody, to Jimmy Swaggart, to Norman Vincent Peale, to not Pat Robertson, he does the same thing himself, Jerry Falwell. Everybody is buying airtime from them. And it's an enormous financial windfall in that sense, beyond just expanding their own programming as well. And if you want to talk about the tech side of that, exactly how all this worked and why it was so much better than what had been done before, I'll be happy to do that. But, it's in the book, and let's not do that right now. So that's innovation number 2. They create the first privately owned satellite network. And as with most business innovations, the people that get in first really have a leg up. And this just was enormously successful. And with all that money, Bakker does his third big innovative thing, which is he decides he wants to build this new 20th century camp meeting, Christian Disneyland, and that's Heritage USA. Unfortunately, all the money he has from television isn't enough to pay for everything he does at Heritage. And eventually he's just leveraged to the point of disaster. And of course, nobody knows this because it's a church. It's all a church. The books aren't open. Nobody but a handful of people at the very top have access to the books. They have an entirely ineffective board of directors. And nobody really knows what the financial condition of the ministry is until it all falls apart. Along the way, though, he does some potentially brilliant things to raise money. The one that people remember is the Lifetime Partnership Program. So when he was getting ready to build the 500-room Heritage Grand Hotel, he essentially didn't have any money to do that. And they didn't want to get bank loans because it would have involved the kind of oversight that they really didn't want. Particularly, they didn't want to reveal their salaries by that point to lenders as part of the documents. And so what Bakker did is he came up with this scheme and essentially said, if you give $1,000, I will guarantee you 4 days and 3 nights in the Heritage Grand Towers for the rest of your life. And it's actually a brilliant idea. And if he sold, he said basically we're going to do 20,000 of these. So 20,000 times 1,000 is $20 million. And that was the price tag initially to build the Heritage Grand Hotel. So you have 1,000 people, or you have 20,000 people to give their $1,000, and you can build a hotel debt free. It's brilliant. And 20,000 people, if you do the math on 3 nights, is about 50% occupancy. So it gives them, they can sell the other 50% to paying customers that will then pay for the upkeep and you know, the running of the hotel. And if you don't have a mortgage on the place, it's actually a brilliant plan. The problem is it works so well that once they hit the 20,000 mark, they just kept going. And they eventually sold 66,000 lifetime partnership. You raise your eyebrows in the Heritage Grand, which is more than 100% occupancy. And then they just kept going. They announced the Towers Hotel, and they eventually sold 70,000 lifetime partnership in the Towers, and it never even opened. Then they created all kinds of other lodging around the park and began to sell lifetime partnerships in that. And most of it was never even constructed. And all of it is basically using new money to pay old debts. And they were, and of course they never really told people this, but it was leveraged to the max, and it just in stunning financial irresponsibility. And then, of course, the Jessica Hahn scandal breaks in '87. And at that point, because it interrupts their fundraising stream, you know, that's what happens at churches that have these kinds of scandals. It just takes that little bit of slip in giving, and they go under because you know, they needed every penny, every minute, and they couldn't afford that dip in giving that came with the Jessica Hahn scandal. I'm talking a lot. Let me just tell you a little bit about Jessica Hahn, and then maybe we can redirect this in more helpful ways.
Before you go there, can I ask a question about Oral Roberts?
Yes.
Did you have any connection with Oral Roberts? I know it was way earlier, but still.
He did. Yeah. Oral Roberts came to Heritage USA, was on the show. In many ways, Oral Roberts was the model for all of this. And I think Oral Roberts is someone who's underestimated in a really big way. Oral Roberts was a path breaker for a lot of this, both in his own use of TV and creating a university. Bakker initially wanted to build a university at Heritage USA. Of course, Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell do build universities. But Oral Roberts is a pattern for a lot of this. You know. Bakker paid close attention to what Oral Roberts was doing. So Jessica Hahn, and I should tell you, I finally, in this project, and this is kind of a fun story too, but I became friends with Jessica Hahn and her husband, Frank Lloyd, through doing this project. And it just works out that way. Some of the people you interview, you become friends with. Some of the people, not so much. But Jessica and her husband, Frank, are 2 people I got to know fairly well through doing this whole thing. She was a church secretary in Long Island at a small independent Pentecostal church, pastored by a guy named Gene Profeta. And Profeta had been on Bakker's show. And so had another traveling healing evangelist, John Wesley Fletcher, who was centered in Oklahoma, but he every year would come to Fletcher's church and do a crusade, a revival meeting, a healing crusade.
I ended up not liking him very well.
By the end of the book?
By the end of the book.
Yeah.
Wow, he's dead now.
He is, yeah. Died reportedly of AIDS in the 1980s.
Yeah.
90s.
96, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. 90s. So Fletcher would come through. Jessica Hahn, basically, her church in Long Island becomes her entire life. And she has kind of a difficult home setting. Not disastrously so, but the church really becomes the center of her life. And after high school, she becomes the church secretary. She babysits Profeta's kids. And when John Wesley Fletcher comes through town, she babysits his children as well. And they get to know each other. And then Fletcher becomes a presence at PTL, much more so than Jean Profeta. And Fletcher has designs on, he can see that Bakker is the big time. And he has designs on actually co-hosting the show with Jim Bakker and becoming more of a kind of insider of PTL. But Fletcher at the same time becomes notorious for making sexual advances to young men on the PTL staff. He's not very well trusted by, I got to tell you, almost everyone I talked to. And they hadn't talked to each other for a long time, but they all told me the same thing. As soon as I mentioned John Wesley Fletcher, I said, man, I never trusted that guy at all. And it's so consistent that I don't think it's a kind of rehearsed answer after the fact. But Jim was enamored with him. But Fletcher knew that he was just sort of hanging on at PTL. And then in December 1980, he and Bakker go to Florida, to Clearwater, Florida, to do a telethon, which was not really typical for Bakker to do these out-of-town telethons by that point, but not all that unusual either. And Fletcher calls up Jessica Hahn and says, how would you like to come to Florida and meet Jim Bakker and babysit his kids? And she says, yeah, would I ever? She watched Bakker every day on television, bought her first little black and white television just so she could watch Jim Bakker. And she goes to Florida, and this is where her account and Bakker's account differ pretty dramatically. But basically, you should just read the book. She has this sexual encounter with Jim Bakker, and afterwards, it's just, I mean, it's the kind of thing that if it happened now in the post-Me Too movement, you would know exactly how to think about this. But at the time, no one stood up for her, and this is the real tragedy in this. No one in the church took an interest in Jessica's story. And in fact, initially, she didn't want it to get out. She didn't want to damage the ministry. She didn't want this to be, she didn't want the people to know about this. But over time, she just became more and more dissatisfied with how the whole thing was handled. I mean, she later told me if Jim Bakker just called her up and apologized, just talked to her, she would have been okay with that, and she would have let it go. But no one did this at the ministry. And so it bothered her, and she eventually talked to people about it, and word got out, and some newspaper reporters got onto the story. If you read the book, it's actually pretty dramatic. And eventually the whole thing does become public. And but it's not till 87. So this happens in 80, and it doesn't become public until 87. So, you know, think about her part in this. She's living with this whole thing for 6 or 7 years. And she's not the same person in 87 that she was in 1980, because she's had to live with this entire thing. And then the entire scandal breaks, and she's forced into the public light. And of course, Bakker denies everything. Well, not quite everything. More or less, he says that you know, he was set up, and it was all her doing. And, she's generally treated in the press as as an opportunist or a bimbo. It's this kind of 1980s treatment of women who are in these positions. I think the thing is, and Don Hardister said this, if you happen to watch the ABC 2020 thing, I love the moment where Don Hardister, who was Bakker's bodyguard and was also someone I came to really admire through writing this book, said, you know, looking back on it, I can't believe that no one was there for her, that none of us stood up for her, that none of us took her seriously, and nobody did. Preachers become involved in this. Jimmy Swaggart gets involved, John Ankerberg, eventually Jerry Falwell. But they only use Jessica Hahn and her story as a way to get at Bakker. None of them ever reach out to her with any sense of compassion. And I think that's an important part of this story. And it's a part of the story that really isn't evident in 87, 88, or even the early 90s, that I think really is now just because of where we are as a culture.
But she poses for Playboy.
She does do that, yeah. She does a lot of things. She's basically broke, and this is kind of festered for all these time. And the only people that will talk to her, first of all, the first person that she says really showed her any compassion was Howard Stern. So Howard Stern calls her up, and what impressed her so much was he called her up from this radio show and said, "How are you doing?" And she basically said, "Nobody's asked me that. Everybody wants to know about the alleged affair and everything, but no one's actually said, how you doing?" And then she hires a lawyer. She's a really smart person, but she wasn't very sophisticated. Barely finished high school, lived in Long Island, church secretary. She hires a divorce attorney, and together not for a divorce, but just because the attorney she found, and they go to Hollywood and they try and rustle up a deal, and eventually the deal she gets is with Hugh Hefner, a Playboy. And Hefner takes her aside and says, "Well, you can't tell your story anywhere else but here, and we'll let you tell your story." And that's what she does. And then she poses as part of that too. And for a long time, she said, "I have absolutely no regrets about this. They were the people that really reached out to me and treated me like a human being." I think now she's a little more circumspect about all of that, because her life is, it's come full circle in a lot of ways. But it's her introduction to Hollywood. She becomes the girlfriend of a very influential Hollywood producer, Ron Levitt. He's the guy that does Married with Children and a lot of these other kind of lowbrow comedies. And for many years, that's her life. It never really cost her her faith. She says, "I've always been a believer. I've always read my Bible. I just never trusted church people because none of them ever treated me like anything but trash." And I think that's basically fair. She does do a lot of things that I think even now she'll say, "Well, I'm not really proud of that." And there's a lot of it. But yeah, that's that part of the story. So with the scandal, Bakker resigns from PTL. He pulls in Jerry Falwell to take over the ministry. Why Jerry Falwell? Jerry Falwell is a fundamentalist Baptist, Bakker's Pentecostal. They were never very close. He did broadcast a weekly show for Jerry Falwell, but he broadcast everybody's show. Why Jerry Falwell? Well, the reason was he needed a celebrity who would keep up the fundraising. And initially, he and his executive vice president, Richard Dortch, wanted Oral Roberts. But the scandal breaks in March of '87, and in January of '87, Oral Roberts has this moment where he basically he says, "I need money, I need it bad, and if I don't raise, I think the figure is $7 million by a certain date, God is going to take me home." Basically, God is a loan shark, and if I don't pay the money back, I'm done. And so there's a lot of fallout from that, and so they decide, well, we can't really have Oral right now because he's got his own problems. And so they think Jerry Falwell can step in and sort of keep things going. Bakker later says that they agreed that Falwell would be there about 6 months and then exit, and Bakker could step back in. Falwell later said, I never agreed to anything quite like that. But what happens is once Jerry Falwell gets there, he thinks that he's simply dealing with an affair. And he's actually done this before. Falwell stepped in and helped pastors who were involved in an affair and then sort of helped them rehabilitate their ministry. He thinks, and then he gets in and he finds a couple of things that Bakker hadn't quite told him about, which is one, that they were broke and something like 66 million in debt and bleeding $2 million a month. Didn't have to tell Jerry that. And then of course also,
And it's possible he didn't even know it. Bakker.
yeah,
I mean, you in the particularly in chapter simple math, you really, I mean, it's as if he didn't know and didn't care.
yeah, that's a good point. Bakker was very proud of the fact that he didn't worry about where the money would come from or whether he had the money. And he said that at times, God has a different math for believers. It doesn't all have to add up.
I mean, it's just scary how unengaged and uncaring he seemed in that way. It was painted, I found myself asking, is that a mental illness as opposed to deceptive? Because to be that, people were saying to him off camera, well, it's a lot more, it's going to take a lot more than that. And he'd be like, yeah, whatever. Go ahead.
No, that's a good point. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind when people and the prosecutors try to do this too, because they need a motive for fraud. And they basically, the motive they painted was, you did this so that you could live well. You could buy jets and cars and things. And I don't think that's actually it. That isn't what drove Jim Bakker. And he never paid attention to how much money they had. They never had any, they spent it all. One of my favorite anecdotes that I heard from one of his security guards and then from Don Hardister, because I thought, this shows you this guy's mindset. He didn't carry his own wallet. He had a security guard carry his wallet. And what he said to him is, just make sure there's always about $1,000 in there. And then when he wanted money, he would just say to Don or one of his other security guards, I need, I need $200 or I need whatever. But he never even wanted to know. He didn't do, he had a secretary do all of his own family finances, pay all of his bills, keep his checkbook for him. This is someone who avoided paying any attention to money throughout his life. But there's something else there too, because he had people around him, and he had some dedicated, especially early on, he had some dedicated and talented financial officers who came to him and spelled this out in excruciating detail. And this came back to haunt him in the trial, who wrote in memo after memo after memo. And this is in the days of paper, they had them, saying, we are in serious financial trouble. And Bakker ignored those. And, he had every opportunity to know the truth, if he wanted to.
Let me read a few things, and your reflections on them as the interviewer and the person writing it. This woman, as an example, Elaine Sinclair, 57, moved from Boston to Charlotte after her husband's death, began answering phones as a volunteer, went to work in food services, end quote. I wouldn't be anywhere doing anything else, she told a reporter in June 1980. Every day I come to work, I get a lump in my throat. I get the same feeling that I get when I see the United States flag, because I know all this property is anointed by God.
Yes, people loved PTL, they loved the show, they loved Heritage USA. They showed up and felt that it was a safe and healthy place. You could send your kids out all day on the park. They could go to the water park. They had a petting zoo. They could ride horses. They could go to the roller rink. They could do most anything in this very safe place. You could go watch the television show live as part of the studio audience. They had all kinds of seminars you could attend. everything from classes on the Bible to weight loss to how to
Parenting, marriage.
everything. And people would show up and the hotel was nice and they would settle in and they would think this is just the greatest place I've ever been.
Yeah.
It has everything I'm looking for.
Can I ask a question
Yes.
about the surrounding community around Heritage USA? Were there pockets of people that had moved specifically to this area to live and bought homes? And then
Yes.
did that affect the greater community as this organization went down?
It did and it didn't. It wasn't a huge financial disaster for Charlotte. And I don't quite know the extent of that, to be honest, but it doesn't come up in any of the press reports that this is big trouble for
I
Charlotte.
could just see certain subdivisions suddenly
Yeah.
people not being able to pay their bills because now they've lost a paycheck from PTL.
Oh, that absolutely did happen. But it's 2,000 people working there out of the Charlotte
Out of
workforce.
Charlotte.
It's not that big. But what they were doing is Bakker envisioned 30,000 permanent residents on the ground. So they were building condos and houses that you could buy and live there full time. It wasn't just the hotels and the campgrounds and so forth. There were by the end thousands of people who actually lived there. That was their home. And he envisioned a much bigger, eventually a small city that would be Heritage USA.
Did you have access to Jim during writing the book?
So I reached out to him on many occasions. I went down to his new complex in Blue Eye outside Branson. We can talk about that if you want. I apologize. I think I've done the professor thing here and just rambled on.
You're there.
And,
Fine. Not at all.
You need to interrupt me.
Not at all.
And you think, yeah, this
I got it.
this isn't the interesting part at all.
I got it.
He wouldn't talk to me. I mean, once when I was down there, he walked within 3 or 4 feet in front of me. I knew he knew who I was because the staff had told him I was there. The staff was unfailingly kind. They were very nice. They were very polite. I got to know his mother-in-law, Char Graham, pretty well. Char was in her mid-80s, early 80s the last time I saw her. But I went down with one of my grad students once and she walked our feet off, showing us the whole place, and we went everywhere across the grounds. Everyone was unfailingly kind and polite, but Jim would not talk. And I soon realized why. He's never talked to outsiders. He is someone that surrounds himself with an entourage. And one of the producers at PTL, who was there in the early days, left and he came back and was reflecting on how things were when she came back in the mid-80s. She said, first of all, it's totally different. It felt like a family in the 70s, and now it feels like something completely different. And she said, now Jim just moves around in this bubble with these, 6 or 8 or 10 people constantly surrounding him, and you can't even get near him anymore. He just didn't talk to outsiders if he could help it. He would do television interviews because that's what he was, a television personality. But he simply didn't talk to people that weren't part of his entourage. He never has, and I'm sure never will. So no, I did not have a conversation with Jim.
Part of what you described to me when we had coffee, it's okay for me to say publicly, is that you think that Don Hardister and Jessica Hahn ought to tell their story, that the faith community would benefit from hearing from each of them about this experience.
I would love to do that. I'm not sure if either of them would do it. So I did this thing with ABC 2020, and they were great to work with. They really were, but they had a clear focus. It was scandal and money and sex. When I listen to Jessica and Don, especially, I think there is so much more to their story of redemption and reflection on what happened at PTL. And I think those two in particular would just be awesome to have on a stage, for a kind of live chat someone who could draw them out in the right way.
Can you reflect with them a little bit like you did with me about Don in particular? This was his bodyguard of security, as his right-hand
Yeah,
overseer, and he has a lot of thoughtful reflections about the experience.
exactly what you just said. Don was the head of security at PTL. For a long time, he was Jim's personal bodyguard. They had death threats, they had bomb threats. It was a pretty intense position. And Don was never actually involved. I mean, he is a believer by all means, but he wasn't involved in, he wasn't on the television show or involved in the television production. But he was there every minute, and he was close to Bakker physically and participated in a lot, or was witness to a lot of those conversations. He's the guy that picked him up first thing in the morning and dropped him off at the end of the day. And in that sense, Don's position through the fall wasn't that unique, but he's just someone who has become, I think, just wonderfully reflective on what it all meant. A lot of people I talked to for the book essentially said to me, I haven't thought about that in years and I don't really want to think about it because it's just too painful in whatever way. Either that I'm ashamed of what happened or I'm just sad that it all fell apart. But Don's someone who's continued to reflect on things, and he feels immensely guilty for a lot of what happened, even though he was not involved in any of the shenanigans. He didn't happen to go on the Clearwater trip. The Jessica Hahn encounter happened. So, he didn't see the financial books because it wasn't his job. I just think he's someone that whenever I talk to him, I think, wow, I'm really glad I've talked to you, Don. I think those two would be a wonderful, I just think it would be a wonderful event. Not the only two, but if I had to do it, I would say, yeah, let's get those two and do it.
We always hold the 115 hard line, so.
Oh, sorry.
I have a question on what application we can make from this event to what feels like a change in the culture with the rise of megachurches, and how it almost seems like any pastor can be a megachurch pastor if you do a few things. Blue jeans, shirt hanging out, have a rock band, and give a compelling message, or something along those lines. So I guess the application, and not saying that that's wrong, but just making the application from PTL to what we're seeing in the rise of the mega churches. Have you seen any indicators that some of these things are going to blow up again? Because I remember, and this all kind of took place when I was younger, it just felt like such a big black eye on Christianity. And I just kind of wonder, like, are the decks being set for another scandal? I mean, I know that's kind of trying to read into the future, but what applications can we make?
Yeah, first of all, do you really think it's that easy? If it were that easy, wouldn't there?
I don't know.
I tried it. I tried it. I was not able to pull it off.
Maybe it's not.
I think sometimes.
Yeah, the wrong color blue.
Well, innovation is not obvious, or everyone would do it. I think the application is two things. One, there are always going to be ways to work to reach people in a new cultural setting that will work. PTL got big because they were doing something that people were attracted to. You're the people involved in ministry, not me, but I don't see that on the face of it as a bad thing at all. They reached an incredibly big audience. But with that power and influence come dangers. And the dangers are just the obvious ones. That in Bakker's case, the people he had early on in the early 70s were people that were there not for the money, because there wasn't any, they were there because they believed in the mission. They really believed they could change the world through Christian television. And by the way, I didn't get to this, but they were on the air in 40 countries at their height. And huge in Latin America, and did some really innovative things. They didn't just do the American show in Latin America, they created an actual Latin American show that Jim wasn't on. So they were there for the right reasons. By the end of the 80s, Bakker's entourage, they were there for the money and the glitz. And that was his undoing. And is there a way to do one without the other? Is there a way to have that huge influence that you say, well, this is influence in sharing the gospel, right? We are reaching a huge audience, and who can say that's a bad thing? But then is there a way to do that and not have the fallout, so to speak, or everything that comes with it? Please.
Not a question, but a comment. And yes, I hear you saying that, and just some observations. And I speak from being in a system myself, not that big, but it followed a person that wasn't Jesus and that wanted bigger. And so I just heard you say a couple things, that he wanted the TV show because he wanted to follow the culture. And then something else earlier on, I think, that was similar to that. And I do believe, as I said, because in the system I was in, the original intention was good, but there came a point where it got big, and it got lost somewhere. And so when I see that, I think that's not the way of Jesus. Jesus was just the opposite. So if we are following Jesus, how I ask myself the question, how am I participating in systems that want bigger and better and following the culture? Because Jesus didn't do that. So if I'm following Jesus, what would that look like as a person who has participated in bigger and better? That makes sense? Mm-hmm. It's hard to hear all that.
How much longer would he survive without the Jessica Hahn episode? So from he would have fallen, he would have crashed. But that kind of was the precipitous that sort of brought it to the front with Jerry Falwell.
Yes. You just don't know. Probably it would have all fallen apart just from the financial pressures. There is always the possibility, and Bakker's supporters said this, that they could have done what needed to be done to get their financial house in order, and they had plenty of revenue. They probably could have, if someone's really skillful with the finances had come in and said, okay, here's the plan, we're going to do it this way from now on, they probably could have rescued the whole thing. But Bakker had always resisted everyone who had tried to do that, and probably would have to the bitter end anyways. But I don't know.
This book was different in a way for you than the other books because it was more present and you were interviewing the people who knew them.
Yes.
It carried a kind of emotional toll on you, didn't it? You maybe weren't as distant from it as you in the end thought you might be. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm not sure it is, and I'm not sure that says anything good about me.
You cared for these folks.
I did, yes.
And what
that's
happened, it was within our lifetime.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
So there's a kind of emotional
yes.
bearing with that would be different than Francis Asbury's.
Yes. Although you get to know people that are dead, and you get invested in
okay.
that as well. Yeah, I think on balance, I heard a lot of positive stories as well as a lot of really heart-wrenching ones, but they were both there, yeah.
All right, let me let you give any last word, and then I'm going to read from this and let Don Hardister have a word.
Oh, good.
And then we'll say thanks.
Thanks. Don's always worth listening to. So I'm not the minister here. You guys are, and whatever good this does you, I mean, I hope it does some good, but yeah, it's a story that I hope people like you will pick up and reflect on as you move forward.
PTL, John Wigger, Amazon, and is that the best place to get the book?
Yeah, it's probably the cheapest place.
And it'll be a case study, and you've given an accurate reflection for that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bakker always had a talent for identifying cultural trends and crafting a message to fit. Had his role at PTL been limited to this, the ministry might have fulfilled more of its promise. But religious groups have a way of elevating prophets beyond their abilities, a tendency made worse by our modern fascination with celebrity. Don Hardister remembers standing with Bakker next to his car one day before the scandal, looking out over Heritage USA. "Who built this?" Bakker asked, as if he could not believe what he had done. It was as though he had built it just to prove that he could, to rid himself of the sense of inadequacy, doubt, and shame that had haunted him since his youth. Success bred arrogance. Hardister would later feel guilty for buying into the idea that we were, quote, "we were so important that God would not allow this to fail, no matter what we did." He should have done more to rein Bakker in, to make it less about Jim and more about others, he says, continuing his quoting Don. "I pretended a lot. I let a lot of things go that I shouldn't have. I regret that deeply." All right, join me in thanking John for joining us today. And feel free to stick around, but we'll honor our deadline. Thanks, everybody.